Hello and welcome to Mrs. Sagert's English 2 class. This video is made to help those of you who were not able to be in our first class. This year in English, we will be working on literary analysis, kind of a fancy term for learning how to read while paying closer attention to what we're reading. When people write, they use what we call literary devices. And these are things like similes, metaphors, allusions, foreshadowing, different things like that. They use different styles. There's structure. So we typically, when we read a story, we follow a story sequence chart, which we have talked about in previous English classes. And I'm sure that you're somewhat familiar. Even if you don't think you know what it is, you will definitely recognize it when I show it to you. It's just a sequence, the way a story goes. You can see it in movies and books, even in your own life, in the Bible, everywhere. You'll see a story sequence chart. It's just the way we tell a story. So as you can see here, we have Google Classroom up. This is what you will use to get your assignments, turn your work in, communicate with me, communicate with other students, all of that good stuff. So you see that we have English 2, 2021 and 2022 this year. This is for the Thursday class. English also meets on Wednesdays, but we just have, and I just popped to the wrong screen. I'm going to have to definitely do something about that. Pardon me as I get to the right place here. Probably should close that other, there we go. Okay, back to where we want to go. Who knows? Hopefully that doesn't happen too much. I'm doing my best to get better at doing these videos, so I appreciate your patience. So anyway, this is the stream part of our Google Classroom. So this is where you'll find messages, different messages that I make. You guys can make a message. You'll see when I've posted something. We'll come back to this particular part right here, quill.org. I will explain that, and then you'll know what you need to do with that. The second tab is classwork. So this is where you're going to find your weekly homework for each week. You will find those Quizlet links that you need. And then I will be posting other general materials like rubrics, the syllabus will be posted here once I get the dust settles and I finalize my syllabus, and also different materials that you'll need to write certain papers like MLA style handouts or whatnot. So this is where you can find all the information that you need. Now on the people tab is where you're going to find your fellow students. So if you want to email your fellow students to ask them a question or just chat with them about something, you can get that information there. Your view looks a little bit different than mine because this is from the teacher view. Yours is going to be from the student view. So it is a little bit different. I do realize that. I'm going to go ahead and open up homework 1 right now because you are going to need to access some of this while you work on through this video. So you can see that there's a homework sheet, which I will come back to a little bit later. There's, let's see, 3 videos. So these 3 videos you're going to need to come back to and watch them at some point during the video. I will have you pause the video, have you go watch the other video, and then come back to this. And then you'll see a couple items that you're going to need to be able to print and read. So there's the Ransom of Red Chief. That will be for homework. Paul Revere's Ride. You will need to print that at some point during this video and have it in front of you while I read it. So as I said, this year we are going to be exploring literary analysis. So what is literary analysis? I alluded to it a little bit before about how when we read a book, we have to look at it with some information. And one thing, there's actually 3 aspects to literature that we're going to talk about today. And the first aspect of literature that we're going to talk about is context. Okay, so appreciate your patience. So context is our first item of business. Now you might, whenever I write something down, it's always a good idea to have a notebook by you to go ahead and take some notes. Context. What do I mean by context? And honestly, the handwriting here is not awesome. So hopefully if you see any more of my videos, you'll get to see some improvement because this is new for me. Context. Context is so important. Basically, what I mean by context is, when was this book written? Who wrote it? What is happening historically during that time when the book was written? I believe context is so important, and that's why I'm talking about it first thing. It's important to understand, I'm sure that you've heard that many books become banned. There's the banned book list. Well, I don't really think a lot of books should be banned. Do I think that you should read every single book that's ever been written? No, I think there are books that we should avoid. However, just because there's bad race relations in a book, just because a book deals with slavery or some part of history that makes us very uncomfortable, I don't think that's reason to not read it. In fact, I think that's reason to absolutely read that book. But we look at it from the context that it was written in. So, for example, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, that's kind of on a book banned list. And it's because there in that book is a very derogatory term that was used, a name that Black people were called, and it starts with an N. I'm not going to even say the word. But that word was used. So that word's in the book. Does that mean that when we read the book that we're saying, oh, it's okay to use that word? No, absolutely not. But it helps us to understand what it was like back then. And if we just simply try to erase history or clean it up to make it look all good and right, that doesn't teach us anything. We can learn from that bad history by looking at the context that it was written in. And it really helps us to understand the literature, and it helps us to understand what people went through during that time. So, again, I'm not suggesting that every single book is good to read, because I do believe that we need to protect our minds and we need to focus more on the truth and on God's ways than we do on man's ways. And there are some pretty bad books that have been written that I think you should avoid. But I just want you to remember that when you read a book other than the Bible, you are just reading the words of another human being. So they're not omniscient, they're not all knowing, and they don't know truth necessarily. So just remember that. Remember the context rather, that the book was written in. Super important to keep in mind as you're reading a book. And we will be talking about context a lot throughout the year. Now, the second part that I want, so we have context. That's the number one thing, that when we're going to start reading a book, we want to decide what is the context. So number one, context. Okay. Number two, we want to talk about structure. So how is this book written? What is the structure? And like I said, with structure, you are going to see that all stories are going to follow a certain structure. Now, we've talked a lot about the story sequence chart. And I want to go over that with you again to remind you of what a story sequence chart is. So basically, it's kind of this triangular looking thing. So I'm going to go ahead and just do my best here to draw the story sequence chart here. Okay. And at the base of every story, we have what we call conflict. We have a main conflict in the book. What is conflict, you ask? Well, every story has some sort of conflict, whether that's man versus himself, like something inside his or herself that they're battling. The characters battling temptation, or they struggle with lying, or they're trying to overcome some negative aspect of themselves. So the whole book is following that conflict. Man versus nature. Perhaps it's an adventure story and they're battling against nature. There's all kinds of things happening in the world that's working against them in nature. And then there's man versus culture. Maybe the culture is against them and they're battling against all the things happening in the culture. Or man versus God, man versus man. Maybe they're trying to battle against evil people. So the conflict is sort of the base or the foundation of our story. So, again, man versus society, man versus himself, man versus man, man versus God. Those are some of the major conflicts that we see. Then, kind of the other thing that we think about when we're looking at books is the plot. So, what is the plot? What is the storyline? Okay. And then the chart, it follows a certain pattern. So in the beginning of a story, we have what we call the exposition. Okay, so that's right here. That's the exposition. I'm not going to write the word right now, but that's like the setting of the scene. Where is this taking place? Who are the characters? All of that kind of thing. It's setting and figuring out what is the story, where is this taking place, all of that good stuff. And then we have some rising action. So some things start to happen here that tell us a little bit about what is this conflict that we were talking about. Some events happen where we start to understand what that problem is. And then at the peak of the story, the top, the high point, we call the climax. That's kind of where something really turns. Like all of a sudden, a big event happens. It's kind of it's like a turning point. And then the whole story turns from there. It's the highest point of action. It's the aha moment when the resolution of the conflict kind of becomes clear and things like that. And then we have down here, then it kind of starts to the falling out of the story. We also can call it, it's a fancy word. It's called denouement. It's the author discloses the secrets of the plot, kind of unravels the mysteries and answers the reader's questions about the book. And then we have the conclusion, the very last part, the conclusion here. The conclusion is the author kind of closes up the story, putting kind of an interpretive spin on the events. And also usually there's something about the theme. Now that is one other word that I want to write here. That's another really important part of a story. And that's a theme. So you're going to see themes throughout stories a lot. That's the main idea of the story, the underlying issue that the characters wrestle with, they encounter. It's kind of the universal truth about human life that the story examines. And with that, right now, what I want you to do is I want you to pause this video and I want you to pop over to Classroom and I want you to click on this video right here. It's called Literary Term 1. And I want you to click on that rather than me playing the whole video here on this particular video that I'm recording right now. I would like you to pause, go over here to Classroom and click on that Literary Term 1. And right in there, she's going to talk about theme and tell you what theme is and how we can discover the theme of a book. So go ahead and do that. Press pause. I'll wait. And when you're ready to come back, press play again. And I'll be right here to tell you the rest of the lesson. All right, so now you know a little bit more about theme and you know about the story sequence chart. We're going to be discussing that a whole lot during this year, so you'll be learning a lot more about that. So we have context. That's the background of the time period, the author, all of that of the book. That's very important. The second thing was structure. The third thing that you need to know, actually, I'm going to go ahead and do the third thing is style. So what kind of style is the book written in? We have lots of stylistic techniques that we use in writing, and we have onomatopoeia, which is a sound word. We have alliteration, which is using two of the same consonants in close proximity to one another. We have personification, which is making a inanimate object like a frog, say, come be as a person, or we can even make the wind like a person. So to give you some ideas of stylistic techniques, I would like you to now pause this video again, pop over to Classroom, and I want you to find this literary devices in pop culture. So pause this video, pop over there to Classroom, and watch the literary devices in pop culture. Go ahead and do that right now, and I'll be waiting here for you when you're done with that. So what did you think? He talked about, I think it was about 8 different literary devices. There are a lot more literary devices than that, but that gave you some good examples of literary devices. And actually, what I would like you to do now is print out the Paul Revere's Ride, if you haven't done so already. So go ahead and pause again and go print Paul Revere's Ride. Now, hopefully you remember some of those literary devices. So when I read, you're going to be looking at Paul Revere's Ride. And as I read that and you follow along, I want you to mark that up. I want you to find some alliteration. I want you to find some onomatopoeia, because there's some onomatopoeia in there. I want you to find some similes. And anything else that you can find like that. And on your page, I would like you to mark that as I read it. So if you see any of those literary devices as I read this, I want you to mark them on your paper. Paul Revere's Ride by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. There's some context right there, by the way. So when this was written, this had to have been quite a while after Paul Revere's Ride, right? Hardly a man is now alive who remembers the famous day and year. That is where you can find context. The author often tells you right there in the writing of the context. I will continue. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. 1 if by land and 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. Then he said, good night, and with muffled oar silently rowed to the Charleston shore. Just as the moon rose over the bay, where swinging wide at her moorings lay the Somerset British man of war, a phantom ship with each mast and spar across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hulk that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile, his friend through alley and street wanders and watches with eager ears, till in the silence around him hears the muster of men at the barrack door, the sound of arms and the tramp of feet, and the measured tread of the grenadiers marching down to their boats on the shore. Then he climbed the tower of the old North Church by the wooden stairs with stealthy tread to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch on the sombre rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade by the trembling ladder steep and tall to the highest window in the wall. Where he paused to listen and look down a moment on the roofs of the town, and the moonlight flowing over all. Beneath, in the church yard lay the dead in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear like a sentinel's tread the watchful night wind as he went, creeping along from tent to tent and seeming to whisper, all is well. A moment only he feels the spell of the place and the hour and the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead, For suddenly all his thoughts are bent on a shadowy something far away, where the river widens to meet the bay, a line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. Meanwhile, impatient to mount and ride, booted and spurred with a heavy stride, on the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side. Now he gazed at the landscape far and near. Then, impetuous, stamped the earth and turned and tightened his saddle girth. But mostly he watched with eager search the belfry tower of Old North Church, as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral,